Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Paradigm Shifts podcast with your host, Keisha Kruger. I'm an organization development practitioner and executive coach, working with leaders to create positive changes in the workplace using behavioral science. My personal mission? Share science-based tools and leadership insights from the field that you can use in the workplace and beyond. Considering we spend about 3/4 of our lifetime at work, there is incredible science and organizational psychology that could be used to rethink the way we work, lead, and ultimately live. Join me as I speak with thought leaders and business leaders in practice, unpacking light bulb moments for paradigm shifts. On this week's episode, we chat with Marc Prine of MIP Consulting. He is an IO psychologist who partners with clients to provide guidance and develop custom-built programs that are constructed around individual, team, and organizational outcomes. Marc has over 12 years of consulting experience working with organizations from financial services, technology, life sciences, manufacturing, and both federal and local government. Marc earned his Ph.D. in business psychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, an MA from Westchester University of Pennsylvania, and an undergraduate degree from Temple University. He is an adjunct professor in statistics, and his work has been published in the Huffington Post, Forbes, and Fast Company. For more information about Marc and his services, be sure to check out the show notes. Hi, Marc. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I'm glad to have you here. You're an industrial organizational psychologist, and you have your own consulting firm, and you focus on assessments and selection. That's kind of like your forte. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's really how do you use data to help people be successful in the workplace, right? Whether it's who's the best person to hire, succession planning and development has been really big over the last few years through this great resignation. I'm seeing clients who want to take the same principles that we use in hiring and really think, well, at any point people are leaving and growing in different directions. I want to make sure that I have a bench of people who maybe have some coaching and have some skills that if they're the next person up, you know, that they can fill into those roles. So that's been a lot of what I've been working on and focusing along with the selection and some of those other things that you mentioned.
That's perfect. And it's a great segue into this first question I have because it relates to the great resignation and the pandemic and all the economic concerns that we're seeing in the workplace and beyond, right? And those things are impacting employee hiring and retention. Are you seeing organizations become more or less selective during the hiring process?
So I think that the good companies that are building a sustainable organization right now are actually being more selective because they're recognizing that they don't want to have um, these kind of relationships with their employees that are very transactional, right? Throwing money at the problem when it comes to signing bonuses and salaries. That's not going to keep them sustainable. It's going to be about making sure that they're bringing on the right person that feels fulfilled within their organization, right? When they're providing these good, realistic job previews, when they are have good interview processes that they know that this person's going to be a good fit, because when they just kind of open the door and let anybody walk in who's willing to take that salary, they realize pretty quickly that that was a mistake, and they're not hitting their KPIs and they're not hitting their numbers, and so um, the people who I've been working with are really trying to think strategically about that and what are the things that we can do to prepare our managers so that they make good decisions, because at the end of the day those are the people who need to live with it. And you make your sign-on bonus, you come into an organization, you set up your direct deposit, and then basically once that happens, money stops being a motivator as
Mm.
much, right? And while other carrots might come down the road from recruiters reaching out, or you hear of these other things, I saw an interesting stat that about 25% of people who have left an organization during the Great Resignation are regretting their decision. And that's only what 6-8 months into this whole Great Resignation type thing. So um, people are realizing that the grass isn't always greener, and the dollar might get you further in one way or another. But if you don't like going to work every day, that's going to have a bigger impact on your life than a few dollars.
Yeah, and when you quantify that, the expenses to the organization, right, is it gets really expensive to bring someone on, go through the entire onboarding process, have them sit within the organization, and then see like a complete decline in performance. The training, all of that impacts the bottom line. It gets really, really expensive.
Yeah, I have a few clients that have been getting really sophisticated with their people analytics to the point where every time that a role is open, they can quantify per day what that costs the organization. And so if you're filling the same role, two or three times in a year, and that role, is open for 30 to 60 days every time that you need to replace that person, right? That turns into a lot of money, right? Retention, people don't want to make that upfront investment, but they don't really recognize what it costs them when they don't make that
Yeah.
investment. There's that funny LinkedIn meme that kind of went around that it's like the CEO and the CFO talking. The CFO says, "What if we pay to invest in all these people and they leave?" And the CEO says, "Well, what if we don't invest in them and they
Mm.
stay?" And so what happens there?
That's so important. I use that meme in some of my presentations when I'm working with our executive team. It's just kind of a reinforcement to the value of that upfront investment. And you're saying that you're seeing people become more selective, or organizations being more selective. Hiring for cultural fit is a tricky process. When an organization doesn't clearly understand or have really defined their culture, right? Because you need to, if you're going to hire for a cultural fit, you need to understand what your culture is. And so, what are your thoughts on that? Like hiring for a cultural fit, what that process looks like?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think the whole idea of culture is something that's been completely misconstrued by the private
Mm,
sector, and especially Silicon Valley and the tech community, right? You think about corporate culture, and you think about the Facebook and the Googles and the Apples of the world, where we've got cool offices and beer kegs and ping pong tables, and we wear jeans on Friday, right? That's not
mm-mm,
culture, right? That is, those are benefits, those are perks, that's a work environment. Culture is by definition in academia, right? What are the behavioral
mm-hmm.
norms, right? How do a group of people make decisions? How do a group of people hold each other accountable? What leadership styles do and do not work within an organization? And so most of the time when I'm doing that, I'm codifying culture in by means of behavioral competencies, and really seeing like what is not just the what somebody needs to do in a role, right, that you see on a job description, but how do they need to do it, right? How do they do all of those things that I mentioned earlier, and then tie those back to ways to interview and use assessments and other types of tools in order to predict performance.
Yeah, so culture is like how we do what we do, right? If you're going to sum it up, and
Hmm.
how do you measure that? How would an organization measure that?
So again, I think a lot of research says that it comes back to the competencies, right? Using a good competency model and then interviewing based on that, right? You can ask good behavioral based questions where what they do in that situation isn't as important as the way that they did it, right? You ask somebody a question like, "What's the hardest business decision you've had to make?" and see, did they reach out to other people on their team? Are they collaborative? Are they decisive? Are they using data? Do they have analysis paralysis, right? All of those things that you can, I don't care what the actual problem was that they needed to
Mm.
fix, right? I mean, I'll look to see if it's a menial task or if it's something that actually had some meat to it. um, but what I'm really looking at in some of those questions, and what I'm training interviewers to do, is really unpack that answer and see all of the underlying approaches that they're taking, and basically ask the question, if they use that approach here, would that work?
Mm. That's really important. And when we're talking about hiring and some of the selection processes that organizations are using, I'm seeing assessment tools become more and more of a popularity or trend in terms of like how we go about selecting. And there are risks associated when you use assessment tools that are not psychometrically sound. What are
Mhm.
they, and how can organizations ensure that they are doing right by the employees? Because if you're going to utilize an assessment, it needs to be valid. It needs to be measuring what we want it to be measuring, what it says it's measuring. Otherwise, what are we doing? What we do with that information is pretty unethical, in my opinion.
You're absolutely right. I talk to clients about good selection programs. It's not necessarily glamorous. It's not sexy, right? It's diet and exercise, right? Everybody wants the magic pill that's going to cure their problems and help with their weight loss. We all see how all of those things peak and valley and tend to not have much efficacy. Diet and exercise works, right? And so when you identify the right competencies that you want to measure, when you build interview guides that measure those competencies, when you select a good, valid, reliable personality assessment that measures those competencies and supplement that with cognitive ability or and reference checking and all of these other predictors, you add, every time that you add something, you're adding some incremental validity into the process and really getting it better and better, right? Thinking about, okay, well, if I have a good diet and then I add a little bit of cardio and then I add a little bit of weightlifting and then I add some good, meditation or mindfulness work that increases my sleep and all the right. That's how you build a healthy body. It's not fun, it's not sexy, but it's work. And that's what research shows works.
Yeah, and like I said before, and more, at least what I'm seeing, hiring managers are requesting the use of assessment tools to support their decisions around cultural fit. But I've also noticed that
Mm-hmm.
the attitude and perception of a prospective employee when they're being asked to take that assessment may feel burdened by that because it's like, oh, it's another tool, another thing, or what are they going to do with this assessment tool? I mean, I do believe there's some validity um, in that perspective, right? Especially because we're trusting the organization to not screen us out based off of the results of this solely. So,
Mm-hmm.
tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so any piece of data is one piece of data in an overall set that you're collecting through the process, right? You're not going to make one decision based off of one number, right? You really want to make sure that you're telling a whole story, right? And so you've got somebody's resume and you decide that this is somebody that you want to talk to and you bring them into an interview. And then does the personality data, agree with or does it conflict with what you learned during the interview? Are there themes that you're picking up that you're making decision based on kind of a comprehensive pool of evidence versus just one little number that you see? And then on the back end, I think that there's a great point that you kind of say there of like, well, what do we do with the data? Right. And I don't necessarily think that personality data should be used or assessments or other tools should be used as a knockout. But like I said, as one part of a comprehensive decision. But then after that person starts with the role, right after they, get through and they get their offer and they start, um, why do we why do we hesitate to show them that data? Why do we hesitate to show them this is what we were measuring during the interview process? I talk about competency models as it should being the hub of the employee life cycle, right? A competency model and those key behaviors, that's what you should be using and looking for in recruitment. That's what you should be measuring during selection. Those are the ways that you should bring people into the onboarding, onboard them through the process and help them understand this is what we expect you to do. There's a crazy phenomenon within psychology research that if we tell somebody what we expect them to do, they're more likely to do it,
Hmm.
right? And it's mind blowing. But it's this cryptic thing where I'm going to measure something and I'm not going to tell you what it is and just hope that you magically land on those behaviors, right? Well, why don't we tell them what we want them to do and expect them to do and then measure that, right? So use that during onboarding. Use your assessment data that you collected and said, all right, well, here are the 6 competencies that we measured during the process. Here's how you matched up in the interview. Here's how you matched up in the personality data. Let's talk about how we can start you off on the right foot because we think that you're a good fit here and we want you to be successful. And then use those same competencies to be part of the performance management and annual appraisal process. Hey, you're demonstrating these behaviors. You're hitting your KPIs and doing the what we need to do you to do, but you're also doing it in the way that we want you to do that because that's going to help us grow and scale our culture. So those are really some of the things that I talk about, right? And then succession planning, learning and
Yeah.
development, it all kind of fits into that life cycle.
Competency modeling, it's so crucial. It's kind of like the glue that holds the organization together if you think about it. And I'm glad that you went there with the performance management piece, because you can't just start with it in hiring. You have to carry it through. And the other important piece that you mentioned that I is so critical, and I discuss this all the time in my firm with our managers, is the clarifying expectations. Like, are we aligned on the expectations? Do your employees know what is expected of them? Because more times than not, when a problem or a challenge arises to the HR department, and it's called an employee relations problem, more often times than not, when you dig in, it's really the manager who didn't share, in a really clear, defined way what those expectations were.
Hmm. Yeah, I speak with clients a lot about crafting their realistic job preview, right? All of the research that I did in grad school was looking at organizational socialization, how somebody comes into an organization, learns the ropes, becomes like a member of that organization, and how that predicts employee engagement, right? Their willingness to go above and beyond and drive performance, productivity, profitability, a lot of those things. And everything kind of came down to that removing ambiguity, right? Providing a realistic job preview up front, during the interview process, right? How often do we join an organization and we're like, wait, you didn't tell me that I have to do this.
Mhm.
What's that, right? So telling people, right, and that's kind of some of the push and pull, right? We're in this recruitment process. We're trying to get employees. We want to entice you to come to work here. But if you show up on day one and you feel like you were bait and switched, that psychological contract is
Mhm.
broken, and I no longer trust you as my
Yeah.
employer,
Morale
right?
goes
And you might not realize it on that day, but it chips away
down.
at it, and it chips away, and it chips away, and it chips away. Versus saying like, "Hey, part of the job that really stinks here is you're going to have to do X, Y, Z. It's not fun, it's not glamorous, but it's just part of the role, and it's going to be part of 10% of what you do." And you're like, "Oh, okay, 10%, it's not bad." And so while I'm doing that task, I'm like, all right, I signed up for this. I knew I was going to have to do this. This is on me that I don't like doing it.
Yeah.
And that's not there. There's no kind of disdain for it, and then that needs to pull
Yeah.
through, right? Like you're talking about those performance expectations. Hey, you did this, right? This is where like 90-day reviews, I think, sometimes are underutilized as an opportunity to really course correct,
Yes.
right? 90-day reviews are almost used as another recruiting tool to say, hey, you're doing great, awesome, great job. um, this is where you can really tweak performance, because you're able to say, hey, remember that thing I told you about during the interview? um, Good try, I like what you did here, I like the effort and the energy. Maybe let's do it a little bit differently.
Yeah. What do you think holds managers or leaders back from providing that clear input to the employee?
um, I think that it's something that really needs to be thoughtful and purposeful, and it doesn't come natural,
Mm.
right? It's not something that, um, you know, I I joked. I had an intern and we were doing some process work, and I had her put together the instructions of how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Something as simple as put together a list of, if you're teaching somebody how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, what to do, right? And I'm going to read that, and I brought all the materials out, and I'm going to read that, and I'm going to build the peanut butter and jelly sandwich using your directions. She didn't tell me to open up the jars to the peanut butter,
That's so
right?
powerful. Wow.
Some of those little things we don't do, right? Some of those little things that we think that we're saying and communicating, we're not actually saying and communicating, right? You are in the organization as a manager, you live it day in and day out. And so some of those things that are just come natural to you, and you know all the little mannerisms of the organization, that new person doesn't know that yet. That's on you to help them learn and get up to speed and think about it. And so, you know, being really clear on descriptive on some of these expectations, it's just something that we don't think about, right? Daniel Kahneman talks about type 1 and type 2 thinking, right? What are the things that we just do automatically? And what are the things that we do really slowly and thoughtful and purposefully, right? New employee is going to be slow, thoughtful, purposeful. Manager is going to do it through automation.
It's amazing. Hey everyone, I want to take just a quick break from this week's chat to tell you about something very exciting. It's something for those of you who listen to my podcast that train Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and it's called BJJ Summer Week. So, what is it? Imagine participating in one of the biggest BJJ community camps in the world and training amongst hundreds of other BJJ practitioners. People coming from all around the world with the willingness to share their culture and their knowledge of BJJ with each other. That's what BJJ Summer Week is all about. It's 5 days of seminars, parties, excursions, incredible food, and more in the capital of the Mediterranean, Cagliari, Sardinia. And the next BJJ Summer Week is happening next year from September 20th to the 24th of 2023. If this is something you'd be interested in joining, there is an early bird special if you book now on www.bjjsummerweek.com. If you book by December 31st with the code Paradigm Shifts, you'll get a tatami gi for free. You have the right to cancel the camp before 30th of May for any reason. I'll be there. I'm so excited to go next year. I was there last year. So what are you waiting for? Get your BJJ friends together and start the planning. Book today. Join BJJ Summer Week. Now, let's get back to this week's chat. Going back to the assessment tool, when we build in those competencies, right, to assess for cultural fit, it seems like the assessment would need to be custom to that organization then, right? Because not every organization is going to have the same competencies. So how does an organization go about that then, building a custom assessment?
So it doesn't necessarily need to be custom. It just needs to be augmented, right? A lot of what I do, and all too often, people say, "Oh, we want to use a personality assessment," and they pick an assessment. And I say, "Well, what do you want to measure?" And they're like, "I don't know. We want to measure what this assessment measures." I was like, "Are you
Sure.
sure?" Right? Yeah. Oh, well, our competitor uses it. Our client uses it. Oh, this one's great. Okay. Well, that's where the competency modeling comes in. And first, let's identify what you want to measure before you pick a tool to measure it, and then doing kind of, I'll work with clients on doing kind of a scan of the marketplace and saying, okay, well, if these are the competencies that you want to measure, here are the different criteria and things that you want to do. And then you don't necessarily need to customize it. You just kind of map your competencies to what they measure, right? Most big five, good, thorough assessments are going to measure in some combination every kind of competency that you're going to want to measure, right? If you're picking the right ones. And so making sure that when you're when you wouldn't go out and buy an ERP system or a CRM or any kind of huge piece of technology without doing requirements
Yeah.
gathering, right? That's kind of step one of buying any kind of technology. Yet we go out and we buy these assessments without doing that requirements gathering, right? Your competency model, that's your requirements gathering. Let's know what we want to measure. And then what do you do when you buy an ERP system? You say, okay, well, let's tweak the process here. Let's add this kind of little piece there. You do the same thing with an assessment. You buy your assessment. You say, okay, these are the 4, 5, 6 scales that actually matter to us. We're going to make sure that we do something with this reporting so that we can give it to the hiring manager to be easy to read and they know exactly what's important.
Yeah. I love that translation. And then employees, I like to think that it's an employees market, not an employer's market right now. And they're interviewing organizations for fit just as much as organizations are hiring for fit. And it feels like, to me, employees have a lot of leverage right now in that process. So what do employees need to consider when they are deciding on an organization that's right for them?
So I think that the questions that employees should be asking are about growth opportunities. Understanding where do you see me going here. I think that understanding those expectations as much as possible is really important. I think asking leaders about their leadership style and what are the things that they do. Um, I always say like a good question is, tell me about it, almost but asking good behavioral questions as an interviewer as an interviewee is just as important as asking good behavioral questions as an interviewer, right? Because you say something like, oh, tell me about the culture here. And you're going to get a lot of the generic stuff that's written on the posters of the wall and stuff like that. You say, can you tell me about an experience that you had that you think really personifies the culture here? And you're going to hear about a really deep, insightful experience that that person across the table, and you're going to say, oh, I see how these things play here, right? Everybody says teamwork and collaboration is important, right? That's everybody's value. That's on every wall in every break room across America, right? But what does teamwork look like here?
Wow.
What is that, right? What are those things?
I have not heard that before. That's such a really nice turn perspective on, the employee utilizing some of those techniques in an interview. And that really does give them the full picture. It paints a picture around kind of like what that looks like instead of just the print that's on the website, right?
Absolutely.
If organizational leaders like can get one thing right during this selection and hiring process, like what do you think that is? If they could just focus on one thing?
Um, I think, huh? I think it comes down to long term potential,
Mm,
right? Transactional relationships, as I mentioned, within organizations is really short term. I think that there are some organizations that I've worked with that are saying, we know that you're going to have more than one career, right? And we want to show you that you can have more than one career all working in our organization, right? I'm working with one, healthcare based organization that they show their medical technicians ways that they can get into HR and finance and other aspects of the
mm,
organization, because they're saying that we know that you have all of these interests, right? We want you to get bought into the culture and the organization and the climate, right? And, you know, diagonal promotions are still good promotions, right? Somebody going from, one side of the organization to the other shows good longevity, longitudinal kind of lifespan
yeah.
within the organization.
I read an article the other day about what attracts a candidate is not necessarily what will get the candidate to accept the position, and then what keeps an employee in an organization is different as well. And one of the top priorities when someone is in an organization is that career development, the focus and priority on career pathing within an organization. Do I know where I can go in the
Hmm.
company? Is it clearly defined? Those growth metrics, is professional development resources available? Those kind of things. Something actually I'm supporting my firm on now is building out career pathing and career tracks, and then how that translates
Yeah.
into development plans, so that they can focus. And there's different types of development and growth. The growth typically is conflated with promotion. But that's not always the
Hmm.
case, right? Because not everyone wants to move up in an organization. Some just want to be in their current role, but still feel utilized and still feel challenged, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And as you go up to an organization, the further away from actually doing work in some regards happens, right? All too often, people see upward mobility as, oh, I have to become a people manager. Well, what happens? You take your best individual contributor, you promote them. They're maybe not a manager, right? People, being a people manager and being an individual contributor are two completely different things, especially in things like sales, right? Salespeople are notoriously bad managers in some
Hmm.
regards. And so giving people different opportunities to grow. I did work with a professional services firm. They were an accounting firm. Um, and they had that traditional partner track, right? You go from doing somebody's taxes to being on a team to managing a team who was doing taxes to then going out and selling work, right? And that was kind of the way that a lot of big CPA firms are set up. And they realized that, people kind of teetered out and they left. And that's when they would go to this organization or that organization where they were actually doing the work. And so help them build two different career tracks, right? One of them, the traditional partner sales track, one of them, which is more, hey, can this person become an expert where we can maybe bill them out for a higher rate, where they're maybe responsible for bigger projects and doing other things, right? Their profitability that they bring to the firm is just as big as maybe somebody who's out there selling work. but really just helping them recognize that there's different directions that they can go and grow and kind of build their career in a different way throughout the organization, right? Because there's just so many different skill levels that you need to go from being somebody to doing taxes to managing that team to then selling work. I mean, those are three completely
That
different jobs.
transition between
Um,
going after your own goals to then moving and helping others meet their goals is a difficult one, right?
mhm.
Especially if you haven't had exposure to leadership, to the capabilities of leading a team. That's really important. Yeah, I want to go back to that word that you used a little bit ago, potential. Define potential. What does
Mhm.
that mean in an organization? Because I feel like it's thrown around a lot.
Yeah, no, potential isn't what you can do today, but it's what we might need you to do
Mm,
tomorrow. Potential is what are the roles and the growth opportunities that you have? What are the seedlings that you've got inside of you that if we, throw a little bit of water and sunshine on, we can see grow into a tree, right? And so those that's where potential really comes in, right? And I always, um, I've been part of a few projects recently where, again, right, we want to make sure who are the people that can and should grow into management and leadership roles here. And let's assess them based on the competency model of the group ahead of them and not the competency model of the role that they're in right now. And really see, like, okay, what do we need to do to cultivate this talent to help them get to that next
yeah.
level?
When you're talking about assessing or evaluating someone against a competency, what does that look like? Because if that's not clearly defined, right, or if the behavioral indicators are not clearly defined, what that
Mhm.
looks like in the workplace, then how do you it can become subjective from person to person, right?
Absolutely, and that's where things like multi-rater, doing 360 assessments as part of somebody's developmental tool. I like to pair a 360 with a personality assessment, usually because that kind of tells a really nice comprehensive story of here's what a lot of different people say and see from a thematic approach to then, here's what a standardized objective tool says about you, and then let's talk about how we can develop your own style, because I think that that's the big piece of it. Right, all too often we see how the leaders or other people within an organization are, and we think that we need to emulate what they do to do that, but then it comes off as being really
Yeah.
disingenuous. And what we really need to do is talk about developing your own personal leadership style, and if that style works within this context of this organization, then you can be successful. I really want to go back and make sure to emphasize that part of, like, when it comes to cultivating it, these are all the things where your frontline manager, the person that you directly report to, this is why it's so important to develop those
Yes.
people, right? How many people, they say you join an organization, you leave a manager. And if you don't have somebody who is, being thoughtful about talent development, being thoughtful about career growth and trajectory, right? If they're just focused on the here and the now and the accountabilities and really, driving down in that way, like, you're going to
Yeah.
lose.
And for those who are new to a manager role, right, and that's something that they're learning, do you recommend to organizations that there is some sort of a transitionary role between an individual contributor and a manager so that they have the opportunity to shadow, or just incorporate that into like a more advanced individual contributor role, because they do need that exposure to before the promotion is a result of professional growth, not the other way around, not the first step.
No, absolutely. And that's where I say, okay, well, who are the people that you think could be managers, and what kind of opportunities can you give them? Right? Is there a new hire or an intern that they can take under their wing and practice coaching and onboarding and developing that person? Is there a project within your team that maybe they can lead that project and they can get some experience of, setting expectations and delegating tasks and holding people accountable, right? Looking for those growth opportunities there. And that is something that will drive engagement within your organization, right? All too often we say, hey, and this is where the expectation setting comes in that we talked about earlier, right? all too often they'll say, "Hey, I want you to take on this task," or "Can you do this?" or "Can you do that?" And people are thinking like, "Oh, wow, now they're asking me to do another job on top of my full-time job," versus saying, "Hey, I want to develop you into a manager. I think that you've got the potential. And so I want to see how you lead this project. And then I'm going to give you some coaching and we're going to work together on refining your skills to get you ready for that next step."
Yeah, with the assumption
Right.
that the
Some,
individual
some,
wants it, right? Too. That they want
that's a
yeah,
big part. Yeah. That's a big
that's
part of it.
huge.
Right. You're right.
And
That's
and
enough.
and there's a lot of there's assessment happening at different levels. Assessment in the beginning of an employee life cycle and all throughout. When we are assessing for potential leadership potential, growth within an organization,
Mhm.
who's responsible for assessing? Because do they need to be trained, qualified, or is it just something that we need to support within? Going back to supporting and developing and investing in those managers.
I mean, I think all of the above there. There's not one way of doing it, right? I think training, no, the number one way of assessment and really, is your frontline managers and teaching them on how to give good coaching and feedback, right? Training them on performance management and really good processes there, right? Not just setting goals from a KPI perspective of how many widgets should you be making, but also, really focusing on how you do it and what you did and how'd you work with the team and all of those things there, right? That's kind of step one. Obviously, when it comes to 360s and personality and some of the more sophisticated things that you might want to do to get some kind of broader long-term potential, right? That's where somebody like me steps in and helps kind of augment your team and build out a process and leaves you with something that maybe can be replicated by managers and people who get trained and taught on how to do
Yeah,
that.
thank you. I can't believe we're coming up. We need to close out here. It's been an amazing conversation, and I could probably chat a little bit more. But one last question that I have for you is: what is the most recent paradigm shift that you've experienced, whether it's related to this work or anything outside of
Um, that's a good question, right? I think the paradigm shift between the power of the employee versus the
that? Mhm.
employer is something that's there. I think that leadership is now really seeing the need to invest in their people and understand them and see them as the asset that they are, right? I think the shift, and you're kind of seeing it, right, where people are being called human capital and not human resources, right? It used to be a resource that could be depleted versus capital that can be
Ah,
invested, right? That's kind of very different shift, and so I'd say that that's really it because we've heard for generations that our people are our biggest assets and resources. Um, that's what CEOs have been saying forever. I think we're finally seeing them actually put something
yeah,
behind it in some
putting their
ways.
money behind it, right? It's a good shift. That's such a good shift. So I'm excited and looking forward to kind of seeing and following that along. And I appreciate your time today and thank you for this chat. It's been wonderful.
No, thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a review, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening. If you know a business leader in practice or friend who you think would be interested in this episode, please consider sharing it with them. I am so grateful for your support. For more updates, you can follow us at Paradigm Shifts Podcast on Instagram. See you on the next episode.